The grand masquerade of Strathmore Hall had been Vivian's idea from the beginning, and every soul in attendance knew it, even if they were too polite to say so aloud. The orchids alone had taken 3 weeks to source from a grower in Devonshire. The musicians had been selected after Vivian attended 4 separate performances and made notes in a small leather book she carried everywhere. The silk canopies overhead were a shade of deep ivory that she had argued for persistently with the decorator, who had wanted cream, and the difference between the two was invisible to most people in the room but mattered deeply to Vivian, for reasons she could not easily explain, except that ivory was warmer, and warmth was the thing she was always trying to create, in rooms that were growing colder. If you are already feeling something in your chest, you are exactly where you belong. Welcome to Duke Royal Tales, where love is never simple and neither is forgiveness. Subscribe now and stay close, because this story is only beginning. 300 guests filled the ballroom of Strathmore Hall that November evening. They wore masks of velvet and feathers and painted porcelain. They drank champagne from crystal flutes and admired the orchids, and turned slowly beneath the ivory canopies as the orchestra played the first waltz of the evening. And they whispered, because 300 people in masks always whisper, and the whisper moving through the ballroom that night was not about the orchids, or the canopies, or the extraordinary table arrangements that Vivian had spent 11 days perfecting. The whisper was about the Duke. Edmund Strathmore, 8th Duke of Strathmore, had arrived 40 minutes late to the ball his wife had built from nothing, and he had arrived with Cecily Holt on his arm. Vivian saw them from across the ballroom. She was standing near the far window with Lady Rosalind Fern, who had been her closest friend since childhood, and who had a talent for reading rooms that bordered on supernatural. Rosalind's hand closed around Vivian's wrist before Vivian had fully processed what she was seeing, a gesture of warning, or steadiness, or both. Vivian did not need it. She was already very still. Edmund wore his black mask pushed slightly to the side of his face in the way he always wore things he considered formalities, halfway, with visible impatience. Cecily Holt was beside him in a gown the color of deep garnet, and her mask was gold, and her hand rested on Edmund's arm with the ease of a woman who had been practicing that particular gesture for some time. She was laughing at something Edmund said. Edmund was not laughing, but he was leaning toward her, and the angle of his body toward hers told a story that did not require narration. 300 people saw it. Vivian knew this because she had spent 8 years learning exactly how news moved through a room, and she could feel the attention shifting, the pause in conversations, the small arrested movements of fans and champagne glasses. She was the Duchess of Strathmore. Her charity masquerade had raised funds for the county hospital for 3 consecutive years. She had personally corresponded with every major donor, had seated every table, had selected every flower and every song. And she was standing beside the window she had chosen because the view of the garden was best from that angle, watching her husband arrive with another woman at the event she had spent 4 months constructing. She did not move for 15 seconds. Rosalind's hand was still on her wrist. Then Vivian straightened her spine, which was already very straight, and she said, quietly, "I should speak with the caterers about the second supper course." And she crossed the ballroom with perfect composure, nodding to guests as she passed, pausing for a brief word with Lord and Lady Fenwick, who donated generously every year and deserved acknowledgement. She did not look at Edmund. She did not look at Cecily Holt. She reached the corridor beyond the ballroom doors and kept walking until she reached the smaller room behind the kitchens where the household ledgers were kept, and where no guest would follow her. She stood there for 2 minutes in the dark and breathed. Then she returned to her ball. Edmund danced with Cecily Holt twice. Vivian counted without meaning to, the way one counts things when the mind needs something to hold on to. She danced once with Lord Fenwick and twice with Rosalind's husband, and spent the remainder of the evening moving through the room as she always did, thanking donors, solving problems, ensuring that the evening ran as she had planned. The caterers needed a decision about the dessert timing. A guest had spilled champagne on the parquet and required discreet assistance. One of the musicians had a broken string, and Vivian knew where the spare strings were kept because she had thought to ask. At 11:30, Vivian excused herself from a conversation with the hospital's chief physician, climbed the wide staircase to the upper floor, and walked to the end of the east corridor where her son William slept. William was 7, and he slept with his arms flung wide and his dark hair tangled against the pillow, and he looked nothing like Edmund and entirely like Vivian's father, who had died 3 years ago, and whom Vivienne still missed every day. She stood in the doorway for a long moment. Then she crossed to his bed and sat beside him and laid her hand very lightly on his shoulder so as not to wake him. He breathed steadily. He smelled of soap and horse from his afternoon lesson in the stables. She stayed for 11 minutes, which she knew because the clock on the mantelpiece chimed the quarter hour while she sat there. When she left, she went to Edmund's study. She sat at his desk in the dark without lighting a lamp. She did not open any drawers or touch any of his papers. She simply sat in the chair that faced the door and looked at the room she had helped him arrange when they had first arrived at Strathmore 8 years ago. The bookshelves she had helped organize, the chair by the window that she had reupholstered after finding the original fabric threadbare, the portrait above the fireplace that she had negotiated to have returned from the previous Duke's second estate, because Edmund had once mentioned, offhandedly, that it was his favorite. She thought about the night they had met, at her cousin's dinner, when Edmund had been placed beside her by an accident of seating, and had spent the first half of the meal in visible irritation at the arrangement before turning to her, quite suddenly, and asking what she thought about the water management problem on his north estate. She had known the answer because she had read extensively about agricultural drainage as a personal interest that no one had ever previously thought to ask her about. Edmund had stared at her for a full 3 seconds after she finished speaking. Then he had smiled, and it was the smile of a man surprised by something wonderful, and Vivienne, who had carefully managed her expectations her entire life, had felt something loosen in her chest in a way that was both wonderful and frightening. They married 6 months later. She was 26. He was 32. He had seemed genuinely delighted by her in those early years, or at least genuinely interested, which she had learned to distinguish as different things. He liked talking to her about the estate. He liked that she read the same journals he did and had opinions about them. He called her formidable once, at a dinner party, and she had flushed with pleasure, and he had noticed and looked pleased that she was pleased. That was the first year. By the 3rd year, she had become indispensable in the way that furniture becomes indispensable. You do not notice a chair until you need somewhere to sit. She sat in his study for 20 minutes. Then she took a single sheet of his writing paper from the desk drawer and wrote 4 sentences with his pen. She folded the paper once and left it on the center of the desk, where he would see it immediately. Then she went to her room, dismissed her lady's maid, and began to pack one trunk with her own hands. By 4 in the morning, Vivienne, William, and their nurse Margaret were in the family carriage on the road south. The ball had ended an hour earlier. Edmund was somewhere in the house. She did not know where precisely and found that she did not need to. William woke briefly as the carriage moved and looked at her with heavy eyes. "Mama," he said, "where are we going?" "To Grandmama's house," she said, which was not quite accurate since the house at Vennor Bay had belonged to her grandmother and had come to Vivienne through inheritance, but it was the simplest explanation for a child at 4 in the morning. The house by the sea? Yes, William considered this. Will there be horses? She thought of the small stable there. "There is one horse," she said. "His name is Fletcher, and he is very old and very fat, and he will like you very much." William's mouth curved. "Good," he said, and went back to sleep. Vennor Bay was in Cornwall, on a stretch of coast where the land fell away in grey cliffs above a narrow beach. The house was not grand. It had 8 rooms and a garden that went feral every winter and needed reclaiming every spring, and a kitchen that let in the cold through a gap in the eastern wall that Vivienne had been meaning to have repaired for 2 years. She had spent summers there as a child. It was the only place she had ever lived where no one required anything of her before breakfast. They arrived at mid-morning. Margaret got William settled and went to see about food. Vivienne walked down to the beach alone and stood at the edge of the water with her boots sinking slightly into the sand, and looked at the sea for a long time. The wind was cold and pulled at her hair and smelled of salt and distance. She did not cry. She had done her crying in the carriage, quietly, in the dark, while William slept, and Margaret pretended not to hear. She stayed at the water's edge for 40 minutes. Then she went back to the house and began making a list of what needed to be repaired. Edmund found the note the morning after the ball. He had returned to the main house shortly after the last guests departed and had gone directly to his study in the way he always did when he needed to think, and the single folded sheet of paper on the center of his otherwise cleared desk was the first thing he saw. He crossed to it slowly, as though he already sensed that it would require him to be still when he read it. The note said this: "I built this house for 8 years. I believe you forgot I was building it. I have taken William to Vennor Bay. I will not prevent your visits. I would prefer your letters went through Mr. Hale for the present. The last line read only, I hope the orchids lasted the evening. They cost a great deal and were very beautiful. Vivienne. Edmund read the note 3 times. Then he set it down on the desk and stood with his hands braced on the surface and stared at it. Outside the study window, Strathmore Hall sat in the gray November morning, every room in it arranged and maintained and managed by the woman who had just left it. He could feel the absence of her in the quality of the silence. It was a different silence from the one he usually lived in. That silence was simply the absence of noise. This one was the absence of something specific, a presence that had been so consistent he had stopped perceiving it as a presence at all. He thought about the previous evening. He did not think about Cecily Holt. He thought about the moment he had entered the ballroom and seen the orchids and the ivory canopies and the precise arrangement of 300 people in a room that had been nothing but an empty space 4 months ago, and how he had felt, without acknowledging it, a deep background pride at the thing his wife had made. And then he had leaned down to hear something Cecily said, and the pride had dissolved back into the air unspoken, and he had not thought about the orchids again. He sent a letter to Vennor Bay that afternoon through his solicitor, Mr. Hale, as Vivienne had requested. The letter was 2 paragraphs long and addressed the matter of Charlotte's inheritance entail, which was pressing, and included a note at the end saying that he hoped the journey south had been comfortable. He signed it with Edmund, Duke of Strathmore, and regretted it immediately upon sealing the envelope, though he did not open it again. Vivienne's response came 8 days later, also through Mr. Hale, and it addressed the entail question with characteristic precision in 3 clear sentences, and added only that the journey had been adequate, and that William had found the horse and was reportedly pleased. She signed it V. Strathmore. He read it in his study and set it beside the note she had left, and he sat for a long time looking at the 2 pieces of paper side by side. The house began to show the signs of her absence within 2 weeks, not catastrophically, not in ways that were immediately visible to guests, but in the way that a well-maintained garden shows drought before it shows death, in small retreats and early warnings that only someone paying close attention would see. The housekeeper, Mrs. Alderton, came to Edmund with a question about the linen order for the winter. He did not know the answer, and told her to use her judgment, which was not wrong but was also not what she needed. The land steward asked about the tenant's winter provisions, which Vivienne had managed with a system of correspondence that Edmund had never examined. He told the steward to consult the records, which turned out to be a ledger in Vivienne's handwriting that detailed 8 years of tenant history in precise and compassionate notes. He read 2 pages of the ledger before setting it down. Lord Prescott came to stay at Strathmore the 3rd week after Vivienne's departure. He was Edmund's oldest friend and his least tactful, which was the combination Edmund found most useful when he needed someone to say the thing he was already thinking, but refusing to articulate. He arrived on a Tuesday, and by Thursday had said everything that needed saying, which he prefaced by pouring them each a second glass of port and looking at Edmund with the expression of a man about to describe an unpleasant medical diagnosis. "You know what happened," Prescott said. Edmund said nothing. "She didn't leave because of Cecily Holt," Prescott continued. "She left because you stopped seeing her. Cecily Holt was the last item on a list that had been getting longer for years." Edmund looked at his glass. "I am aware." "Then behave as if you are," Prescott said. "Because right now you are sitting in a house full of evidence of what she did for you, and you're treating it like a property dispute." Edmund did not respond. Prescott refilled his glass. "I met her the week before you did," he said, "at your cousin's dinner. Did you know that?" Edmund looked up. "No, we talked for 40 minutes about water management," Prescott said, with a kind of wonder still audible in his voice. "I had never in my life discussed water management and found it genuinely engaging. But she made it engaging because she was genuinely interested and because she asked questions that forced you to think." He paused. "She is the most capable person I have ever met who was consistently mistaken for a convenience rather than a mind." Edmund was quiet for a long time after that. "Do not go anywhere. What Edmund does next will either restore everything or prove that some men only wake up after it is far too late. Like this story and subscribe to Duke Royal Tales so you never miss a single moment of what comes next." He wrote to Vivienne himself the following week, not through Mr. Hale. He addressed the envelope in his own hand, sealed it himself, and sent it with his personal footman rather than through the formal post. The letter was short and deeply imperfect, and he knew it was both of those things as he wrote it. He wrote, "Vivienne, I have been in the East Corridor 3 times this week. I do not know precisely why. I think I am looking for something I cannot name, and that may be the point. There is a gap in the window frame of the kitchen. Mrs. Alderton mentioned it. I believe you knew about it. I did not, until now. Edmund." Vivienne read the letter at the kitchen table at Vennor Bay, with the sound of the sea through the window and William's voice from the garden, where he was arguing cheerfully with old Fletcher the horse about something. She read it twice. Then she folded it and put it in the drawer of the kitchen table, which was not where she kept important things, but was where she kept things she needed to be able to reach quickly. She did not reply. Edmund wrote again 2 weeks later. This letter was longer. He wrote about William's last visit, which had taken place the previous weekend when Edmund had traveled to Vennor Bay and spent 2 days in the house by the sea feeling like a visitor in a life he should have been living. He wrote about watching William ride old Fletcher in the small paddock and how the boy sat in the saddle with Vivienne's particular quality of concentration, the slight furrow between the brows, the hands precise even when the rest of the body was uncertain. He wrote about how he had sat at the kitchen table the second evening while Vivienne read by the lamp, and how the silence between them had been uncomfortable in a way that was entirely his fault, because he had not yet learned how to sit in a room with her and simply be present in it, without a purpose or an agenda or a reason. He wrote, "I notice now when I did not notice before. I am not certain what to do with that. I suspect you will tell me if I ask the right question. I am trying to find the right question. Edmund." Vivienne read this one on the cliff path above the beach, in the morning, with the wind off the water and her hair coming loose from its pins. She read it standing up because she had opened it while walking, and then stopped walking, and stood still on the cliff path with the letter in both hands, and the sea below her and the sky above wide and gray and enormous. She read it 3 times. Then she folded it and tucked it inside her coat, close to her chest, and stood there for a little while longer looking at the water. She still did not reply. William asked her once, on a rainy afternoon when they were playing cards at the kitchen table, whether Papa would come to live at Vennor Bay. She considered the question carefully, which was how she considered all of William's questions, because he was a child who could tell when an adult was giving him a managed answer instead of a true one. "I do not know," she said. "Do you want him to?" William placed a card on the table. "I want you both to be in the same house," he said. "Because when you are in different houses, I feel like I am in between them, and I do not like being in between." She looked at her son for a moment. "That is a very clear way of explaining it," she said. He nodded seriously. "I practiced." She thought about William's explanation for the rest of that day and into the evening after he had gone to bed. She thought about the particular loneliness of being between things, and she recognized it because she had been between things for years, between the woman she was and the role she performed, between the marriage she had hoped for and the one she had managed, between being seen and being useful. She had chosen to leave not out of anger, though there was anger, but out of the recognition that she had made herself so indispensable that she had become invisible, and that the only way to become visible again was to become absent. She had not anticipated that Edmund would write. She had anticipated a solicitor's letter and a formal arrangement, and perhaps a visit to discuss William's schooling. She had not anticipated the letter about the kitchen window gap. She had not anticipated the one about William's hands on the reins. She had not anticipated any of it, and it was disordering her in a way she had not prepared for. Rosalind came to Vennor Bay in December, arriving unannounced on a Wednesday morning with a carpet bag and a bottle of very good claret, and the expression of a woman who had information she was prepared to deliver whether requested or not. Vivienne let her in and made tea and waited. Rosalind lasted approximately 9 minutes before she said, "He dismissed Cecily Holt the week after you left." Vivienne poured her tea. "I know," she said. "Mrs. Alderton told me." Rosalind looked faintly deflated, having apparently been expecting this to be news. "He has not replaced her," Rosalind continued. Vivienne did not respond to this. "He attended the county agricultural dinner alone," Rosalind added, "and spent 40 minutes talking to Lord Fenwick about the hospital endowment you established, and by all accounts he sounded as though he was telling someone else's story and only halfway understood the words. He has been writing to you, hasn't he?" "Yes," Vivienne said. "Have you written back?" "No." There was silence. Rosalind picked up her tea. "Are you going to?" "I don't know yet," Vivian said. "What are you waiting for?" She looked out the window at the gray winter sea. "I am waiting to understand what I want," she said. "Not what is expected, not what is convenient. What I actually want." Rosalind was quiet for a moment. Then she said, And I want to be looked at," Vivian said simply. "I want to be looked at by the person who married me, not the person who has just discovered that his household doesn't run itself. I want to know the difference before I go back. If I go back." Rosalind nodded slowly. "That seems right," she said. "It seems right, but it is taking a very long time," Vivian added. "Yes," Rosalind agreed. But then so did the other thing. Edmund arrived at Vennor Bay without warning on a Saturday in December, the 14th week after the masquerade ball. He had driven himself, which was unusual, and arrived with mud on his boots and no valet and a parcel wrapped in brown paper under his arm. William was in the paddock with Fletcher when Edmund's carriage came up the lane, and he saw his father and ran across the frozen ground with the absolute unguarded velocity of a child who has not yet learned to moderate his arrivals. Edmund caught him and swung him up and held him for a long moment with his eyes closed. Vivian watched from the kitchen window. Edmund spent the afternoon with William and stayed for supper, because William asked him to in a way that made refusal impossible. They ate at the kitchen table because the dining room at Vennor Bay was cold and small, and Vivian served the food herself because Margaret had the evening off. They talked about William's riding, and about a book William was reading, and about the coastal birds that gathered on the rocks below the cliff at low tide. Edmund knew more about coastal birds than Vivian had realized, and at one point said something about a particular species that made William lean forward with his elbows on the table and his eyes very bright. And Vivian watched her son's face and felt something in her chest that was too complicated to name. After William went to bed, they sat at opposite ends of the kitchen table with the remains of supper between them and the fire low in the grate. Edmund placed the brown paper parcel on the table. It was not for William. He pushed it toward her. She looked at it, then at him. "Open it," he said. She untied the string. Inside the paper was a bundle of letters, her letters, the ones she had written in her years and never sent, which she had left behind in the desk drawer in the blue morning room at Strathmore, when she had packed her one trunk and left in the dark. She had not realized she had left them. She had thought she'd taken them. She looked up at him. "You found these," she said, "in the morning room." He paused. "I read them." She was very still. "All of them. All of them." Another pause. "I read them in order, and then I read them again. And then I sat in your chair for a very long time." Vivian set the bundle down on the table between them. She could feel the weight of all those years in the paper. The letters she had written to him, and folded and kept because sending them had seemed impossible, and throwing them away had also seemed impossible. And she had been living between those two impossibilities for years, just as William had described feeling between two houses. Edmund said, "You wrote in the 3rd year that you had worn the blue silk because I mentioned it once, and you wondered if I remembered. I did not remember. I do not remember saying it. And when I read that, in the morning room, in your chair, I understood something I should have understood years ago, which is that you had been paying attention to me since the beginning of our marriage with a degree of care that I had never once matched, and that my failure to match it had not been cruelty, but something worse, which was carelessness. Because cruelty requires you to notice someone and then hurt them. Carelessness means you never noticed at all." Vivian looked at him steadily. She had waited 8 weeks and 14 letters, and one very long winter by the sea for something she could not have named precisely, and she was not certain this was it, and she was not certain it wasn't. He continued, "I have been writing to you because I could not find another way to make you real to me again." He stopped and looked away briefly. "That is a terrible thing to say. I know it is terrible. But the letters were the only way I knew how to look at you when you were not there to be looked at." She said nothing. "And what I found," he said, "when I was looking at you on the page, was that I had married someone I found extraordinary and then treated her as a structure, like a pillar holding up a ceiling. You do not notice a pillar until it is gone." The fire made a small sound. Outside, the sea moved against the cliff below in the dark. After a long silence, Vivian said, "You should know that I am not going to come back to Strathmore and resume what I was doing." "I understand," he said. "I mean it," she said. "I am not going to manage the tenants and the linen orders, and the donor correspondence and call it a marriage." He nodded. "I know. I have been trying to learn what you managed." He paused. There is rather a great deal of it." "Yes," she said. "There is." He was quiet for a moment. "I have had several very humbling conversations with Mrs. Alderton," he said. She imagined this and almost, not quite, but almost smiled. She looked at the bundle of unsent letters on the table between them. She said, "I wrote all of those because I thought if I put the words somewhere, even somewhere you would never read them, they would not disappear. That the things I felt would have somewhere to be." He looked at her. "Did it help?" "Sometimes," she said. "And sometimes it made it worse because I could see, in writing it down, exactly what I was not saying aloud." He said, "I would like you to say things aloud now, if you are willing." She looked at him for a long moment. What she saw in his face was not the look of a man with a plan. It was the look of a man who had come with nothing and was waiting to see what happened, which was what she had once asked him to do and had not expected him to manage. She said, "I want us to have dinner together. That is not a political dinner. I want you to read a book in the same room as me and not have a reason for it. I want William to feel he lives in one house and not between two. I want you to notice when I am tired and not ask what needs to be done about it. I want to be looked at, not at my management of things, at me." She stopped. "That is the beginning," she said. He said, "I can do those things." She said, "You could not before." He said, "I know." She said, "How do I know you can now?" He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "You don't, not yet. But you could let me try and see what happens and stop if I fail again." She looked at the fire. The night outside was cold and the house was small and warm and hers, entirely hers, and she had rebuilt herself in it over 4 months in ways that surprised her. She was not the same woman who had stood by the window watching 300 people admire the orchids she had sourced and arranged. She was clearer now. She knew what she wanted in a way that had previously been submerged beneath the endless architecture of other people's needs. She did not want to lose what she had found in herself. She wanted to carry it with her, wherever she went. She said, "I would like to spend Christmas here, at Vennor Bay, all 3 of us, together." He looked at her. "Yes," he said. "Then after Christmas," she said, "I will come back to Strathmore, not to resume what was. We will have to figure out what comes next as we go." He nodded. He said, "I understand." She said, "Edmund." He looked at her directly, which was something he had not always done. "Do not make me invisible again." He held her gaze. He said, "I will not." Christmas at Vennor Bay was imperfect and cold, and entirely unlike the polished celebrations that Vivienne had managed at Strathmore for 7 years. The kitchen was the warmest room in the house, and so they spent most of their time there. The dining room ceiling had developed a minor leak from the December rains that required a strategically placed pot, which William found fascinating and Edmund found educational and Vivienne found representative of the gap in the kitchen wall that was now the gap in the ceiling, and everything at Vennor Bay, requiring repair that she had been meaning to address for 2 years. Edmund asked to know about all of it, the repairs. He sat at the kitchen table with Margaret's pot catching drips behind him and listened while Vivienne described what needed doing, and she watched him write things down in a small notebook, which was new, and felt something shift. He told her things she did not know about the North Estate. Not reports or summaries, but the actual texture of his days there, which were not what she had imagined. She had imagined him moving through his life with the ease of a man who did not need to notice anything because everything had been arranged. In fact, he was often uncertain and sometimes wrong, and had apparently been arguing with the same drainage contractor for 6 years about the same drainage problem and losing each time, and his account of it was so dryly self-aware that she laughed, genuinely laughed, in a way she had not done in a very long time, and he looked at her when she laughed with an expression she recognized from their first year. William on Christmas morning woke before dawn and got into the bed between them, which he had not done in years, being a child with strong opinions about his own independence, but he burrowed between them in the cold and fell back asleep almost immediately with his arms flung wide as always, and the room was dark and the sea was audible below the cliffs. And Vivienne lay on her side, looking at the ceiling and listening to her son breathe. Edmund's hand moved across the blanket and found hers. She let him take it. They lay in the dark without speaking, with William asleep between them, and the sea outside, and it was quiet in the way that Vennor Bay was always quiet, which was the quiet of a place that asked nothing of you and gave you space to hear yourself think. She thought about the morning she had left Strathmore, the careful packing of one trunk, the note on Edmund's desk, the 4 sentences she had written in the dark with his pen and his paper and left for him to find. She had written them expecting that they would be the last words she needed to write for a very long time, or possibly forever. She had not expected 14 letters. She had not expected him to drive himself to Cornwall in December with mud on his boots and her unsent letters under his arm. She thought about what it meant to be looked at by someone who was truly looking, not assessed, not appreciated in the way one appreciates a well-run household. Looked at in the way that she had looked at him since the beginning, with genuine attention paid to the specific, irreducible fact of who he was. She had been doing that for 8 years. She thought it might take considerably less than 8 years to happen in the other direction, if it was actually happening. But she thought it was actually happening, and she thought that was the thing she had needed to know before she could agree to go back. In January, they returned to Strathmore together. Vivian walked through the main house on a gray afternoon with William beside her and Edmund following, and she went from room to room and noted what had fallen into disorder, and what had been maintained, and what had been improved in small, surprising ways that she had not expected. The kitchen window gap had been repaired. Edmund had done it himself, or arranged it, and had not mentioned it. She stopped in the kitchen and looked at the new ceiling around the frame and then looked at him, and he looked back at her with an expression that said only, "I noticed." She went to the morning room. The chair by the window was where she had left it. The desk was clear. The bookshelves were undisturbed, and on the desk, where she had kept her unsent letters, there was a single stack of papers, 14 of them, tied with a ribbon. Edmund's letters to her. He had placed them in the drawer and returned them to her writing desk, beside where hers had been. She stood at the desk and looked at them for a long moment. Then she opened the drawer and put them inside. The first dinner they shared in the Strathmore dining room without guests was on a Wednesday in late January. It was soup and bread and a roasted chicken from the kitchen garden, and they ate by candlelight because Vivienne had not yet decided about the dining room lamps, which needed new fittings, and Edmund had not presumed to make the decision without her. William talked about a caterpillar he had found in the garden, which led to a discussion about insects, which led somehow to the mechanics of water wheels, and Vivienne listened to her son and her husband argue companionably about water wheels with the candlelight, between them and her soup growing slightly cool because she was not eating. She was watching, and what she was watching was this. Edmund turned to include her in the conversation without being prompted. He asked her opinion. He listened to her answer. He looked at her when she spoke. It was not everything. It was not the end of a story. It was the beginning of a different way of living in the same house, which was the harder and more interesting project. But it was real, and it was theirs, and she was visible in it. She said something about water wheels that made both Edmund and William go quiet, and then simultaneously say, "Oh," and she smiled at the candlelight, and picked up her spoon and ate her cooling soup. And outside the dining room window, Strathmore Hall sat in the dark January evening, every room in it the work of her 8 years, and she was in it now, not as the architecture of it, but as herself, and the difference was everything. Weeks later, Edmund found her in the morning room at her writing desk with a letter in front of her. She was reading it. He knocked on the open door, and she looked up. He crossed to her chair, and she turned the letter so he could see it. It was the first letter she had ever written to him, the one from the 3rd month of their marriage, the one about being afraid he would never know how interesting she found him. He had read it before. He looked at it and then looked at her and said, "Send that one." She said, "It is 8 years old." He said, "Send it anyway. I would like to receive it." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she folded it and wrote his name on the front and held it out. He took it from her hands, broke the seal she had just made, unfolded it, and read it again. Then he looked up and said, "I know now." She said, "Do you?" He said, "I am paying attention." She said, "I noticed." He sat down in the chair beside her, in the chair by the fire that she had upholstered all those years ago, because the original fabric was threadbare, and because she had wanted him to be comfortable in his own house. They sat together in the morning room, as the light came through the east windows and filled the room with warmth, and there was nothing managed about it, and nothing performed, and the quiet between them was the right kind, the kind that happens when two people have stopped being strangers to each other and started being known. Vivian built a house for 8 years. She built a life, and she finally became visible in it. If this story moved something in you, you are home here at Duke Royal Tales. Subscribe, leave a comment telling us what you felt, and share this with someone who deserves to be truly seen. More stories like this one are waiting for you.